The rope around Zara's wrists was rough against her dark skin as she sat in the back of the black sedan, watching her father count money with shaking hands. 24 years old, and this was how her story might end, sold like property to pay for his gambling debts. The two men in expensive suits had barely looked at her when they'd agreed to the deal, discussing her like she was a car or a piece of furniture. "She's young, she's smart, she can work," her father had said, his voice desperate and hollow. "Alexander Stone will find her useful, I promise." The name alone had made the men nod with satisfaction. Everyone knew Alexander Stone. Everyone feared him. Zara pressed her face against the cold window, watching Chicago's skyline blur past as they drove toward whatever fate awaited her. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. She'd known this day would come eventually. Her father, Thomas, had been gambling away their family's future for years, borrowing money from increasingly dangerous people. When her mother died 3 years ago, the gambling got worse. The debts got bigger. And now, with nowhere left to turn, he'd done the unthinkable. "Please," she had begged him just hours earlier, when the men first arrived at their small apartment. "There has to be another way. I can get a second job, I can dash." "It's too late for that," Thomas had interrupted, his eyes red and wild. "Do you know what these people do to families who can't pay? Do you know what they did to the Johnson family last month?" She did know. Everyone in their neighborhood knew. The Johnsons had disappeared one night, and their apartment had burned down 2 days later. No one talked about it, but everyone understood the message. The sedan pulled through massive iron gates that seemed to stretch up toward the cloudy sky. Zara's breath caught in her throat as she saw the estate for the first time. It looked like something from a movie, all stone and glass, with perfectly manicured gardens stretching as far as she could see. This wasn't just wealth. This was power made visible, designed to intimidate anyone who dared approach. "Mr. Stone is expecting you," said the driver, a man with cold eyes who hadn't spoken during the entire 2-hour drive. He opened her door and waited as she climbed out on unsteady legs. The October air was sharp against her face, carrying the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that felt like the end of everything she'd ever known. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a crisp black dress and an expression that gave nothing away. "Miss Washington," she said, her voice professional but not unkind. "I'm Mrs. Chin, the head of household staff. Mr. Stone is waiting for you in his office." Zara followed her through hallways that seemed to go on forever, past artwork that probably cost more than her father's apartment, past windows that looked out over grounds that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Her sneakers squeaked against the marble floors, the sound echoing in the silence like accusations. Each step took her further from the life she'd known and deeper into something she couldn't begin to understand. "Is he?" Zara started to ask, then stopped. What could she ask? Is he cruel? Is he violent? Will he hurt me? None of those questions had answers that would make this easier. Mrs. Chin glanced at her with something that might have been sympathy. "Mr. Stone is not what people expect," she said quietly. "But he is fair if you do as you're told and work hard." They stopped in front of massive wooden doors carved with intricate designs. Mrs. Chin knocked twice, waited for a response, then pushed them open. "Miss Washington is here, sir." The office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the estate's gardens. Behind a desk that could have doubled as a dining table sat a man who made Zara's breath catch for entirely different reasons than fear. Alexander Stone was younger than she'd expected, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and sharp features that belonged in magazines. But it was his eyes that held her attention, gray like storm clouds and just as unpredictable. He stood as she entered, and she was surprised by how tall he was, how he seemed to fill the space around him without trying. He wore a simple black sweater and dark jeans, nothing flashy or designed to intimidate, but something about his presence made the air feel heavy. "Miss Washington," he said, his voice deep and carefully controlled. "Please sit down." Zara remained standing, her chin lifted in defiance she didn't quite feel. "I suppose you think you own me now." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe or approval. "I think your father made a foolish deal to save his own skin, and now we both have to live with the consequences." He gestured again to the chair across from his desk. "Please. Sit." This time she did, perching on the edge of the leather chair like she might need to run at any moment. Alexander sat back down, studying her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see too much. "What did your father tell you about this arrangement?" he asked. "He said I had to work for you to pay off his debt." "He said you were." She stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence without insulting the man who now controlled her fate. Dangerous. Alexander supplied, and there was something almost amused in his tone. Fair enough. I suppose I have earned that reputation. He leaned back in his chair, still watching her. Here's what's going to happen, Zara. You're going to work as my personal assistant. You'll live here in the main house in your own room with your own bathroom. You'll eat meals with the staff or alone, whichever you prefer. You'll help manage my schedule, handle correspondence, and assist with various projects as needed. It sounded almost normal, almost reasonable. Zara found herself frowning. That's it. That's it. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk toward her. Your employment contract. It specifies your duties, your living arrangements, and the terms of your situation. Your father's debt was substantial, but it's not unpayable. Work diligently for 2 years and it will be cleared completely. 2 years. The number hit her like a weight in her chest. 2 years of her life, signed away by a man who should have protected her instead of using her as currency. She opened the folder with trembling fingers, scanning the neat typed pages that laid out her new reality in black and white. What if I refuse? She asked, though they both knew it wasn't really a question. Alexander's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew darker. Then your father's debt remains unpaid, and his creditors will collect in whatever way they see fit. And you know what that means. She did know. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where people disappeared when they couldn't pay their debts. She'd seen families destroyed, businesses burned, lives ruined over money owed to the wrong people. Her father had borrowed from loan sharks, and loan sharks didn't accept payment plans or sob stories. So I don't really have a choice, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Alexander agreed, but his tone was gentler than it had been. You don't. But I want you to understand something, Zara. I'm not your enemy. I didn't create this situation, and I'm not going to make it worse than it has to be. Follow the rules, do your job, and you'll be treated with respect and fairness. She looked down at the contract again, at the neat paragraphs that spelled out her captivity in legal terms. 2 years. 730 days. It might as well have been forever. I need you to sign it, Alexander said after a moment of silence. I know this isn't what you wanted for your life, but it's what we have to work with now. Zara picked up the pen he offered, her hand shaking slightly as she stared at the signature line. Once she signed this, there would be no going back. She would belong to Alexander Stone, at least in the eyes of the law and the people who controlled her father's fate. She thought about her mother, who had died working 2 jobs to try to keep their family afloat while Thomas gambled away everything they had. She thought about the dreams she'd had of going back to college, of becoming a teacher, of having a normal life with someone who loved her. All of that felt impossible now, as distant as the stars. But she was alive. She was safe, at least for now. And sometimes survival was the only victory you could claim. Zara signed her name at the bottom of the contract, the ink sealing her fate with a flourish she tried to make confident. Alexander took the papers back, glanced at her signature, and nodded. Mrs. Chun will show you to your room, he said, pressing a button on his desk. Dinner is at 7. You'll start work tomorrow morning at 8. As if summoned by magic, Mrs. Chun appeared in the doorway. This way, Miss Washington. Zara stood to follow her, but paused at the door. Mr. Stone? Why didn't you just... Why this arrangement? You could have demanded the money in other ways. He looked up from the papers he was already studying, those gray eyes unreadable. Because I'm not a monster, Zara. Whatever people say about me, whatever reputation I have, I don't destroy families if I can help it. This way, everyone gets what they need. As she followed Mrs. Chin down another endless hallway, Zara wondered what Alexander Stone needed that was worth binding a stranger to him for 2 years. She had a feeling she was about to find out, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. Zara's room was bigger than her entire apartment back home, with windows that looked out over gardens that seemed to stretch on forever. The bed was large enough for 3 people, covered in soft white linens that probably cost more than she used to make in a month. There was a sitting area with a couch and chairs, a desk by the window, and a bathroom that felt like something from a luxury hotel. It was beautiful and comfortable and felt like the most elegant prison cell in the world. Mrs. Chen had left her with instructions about meal times and a thick handbook about household expectations that Zara was supposed to read before tomorrow. She'd also been given a key card that would let her into certain areas of the house, but not others. The message was clear: she had freedom, but only within carefully defined boundaries. She unpacked the single bag she'd been allowed to bring, hanging her few clothes in a closet that could have held 50 times as much. Everything she owned looked shabby and small in this space, reminders of the life she'd been forced to leave behind. When she was done, she sat on the edge of the massive bed and tried to process what had just happened to her. 24 hours ago, she'd been Zara Washington, college dropout working 2 jobs to help keep her family afloat. Now she was, what? A servant? An employee? A prisoner with benefits? She didn't even know what to call herself anymore. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Chin entered with a gentle smile, carrying a tray with tea and small sandwiches. I thought you might be hungry, she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. It's been a long day for you. Zara realized she was starving. She'd been too nervous to eat breakfast, and lunch had been impossible with everything that was happening. Thank you, she said, surprised by the kindness. Mrs. Chin poured tea into delicate china cups, the kind Zara had only seen in movies. I know this must be overwhelming, she said, settling into the chair across from Zara. I've been working for Mr. Stone for 8 years, and I remember how intimidating it was at first. Is he? Zara started, then stopped. She wasn't sure how to ask what she wanted to know without sounding rude or scared. Is he what the rumors say? Mrs. Chin finished gently. That depends on which rumors you've heard. Zara took a sip of tea, surprised by how soothing it was. People say he's dangerous. That he ruins people who cross him. That he's cold and ruthless and doesn't care about anyone. Mrs. Chin was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. Mr. Stone is a powerful man in a world that doesn't tolerate weakness. He's had to make difficult decisions, and sometimes those decisions have consequences for other people. But in all my years working here, I've never seen him be cruel without cause or unfair to people who work honestly for him. It wasn't exactly a reassuring answer, but it wasn't terrifying either. Zara ate one of the small sandwiches, realizing it was the best food she'd tasted in months. Even the simple chicken salad was made with ingredients that spoke of quality and care. What will my job actually involve? Zara asked. The contract mentioned personal assistant duties, but that could mean anything. Mr. Stone runs several companies and has investments all over the world, Mrs. Chin explained. He needs someone to help manage his schedule, handle correspondence, research potential deals, and sometimes accompany him to meetings or events. The previous assistant left to get married, and he's been managing on his own for the past few months. That sounded almost normal, almost like a real job instead of indentured servitude. What happened to her? The previous assistant, I mean. Did she? Zara wasn't sure how to finish the question. Mrs. Chin smiled, understanding. Jessica worked here for 3 years. Mr. Stone paid for her wedding and gave her a very generous gift when she left. She still sends Christmas cards. She paused, studying Zara's face. I know your situation is different, and I know you didn't choose to be here. But this doesn't have to be a bad experience if you approach it with the right attitude. After Mrs. Chen left, Zara spent the evening exploring her room and reading the household handbook. The rules were extensive but not unreasonable. Wake up by 7, be ready to work by 8, dress professionally, be respectful to all staff members, don't enter restricted areas without permission, don't discuss Mr. Stone's business with outsiders. Standard employment guidelines if you ignored the part about not being allowed to leave. She tried calling her father, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She wasn't surprised. He'd probably disappeared the moment the deal was done, too ashamed or too afraid to face what he'd done. Part of her hoped he was ashamed. Part of her hoped he was suffering with guilt over selling his daughter to pay his debts. But mostly she just felt empty when she thought about him. Sleep came in restless waves, interrupted by dreams where she was running through endless hallways, looking for an exit that never appeared. She woke several times to moonlight streaming through windows that looked out over grounds she couldn't escape, reminding herself over and over that this was real, this was her life now. Morning came too soon, announced by an alarm clock she'd found in the desk drawer. Zara showered in the marble bathroom, using products that smelled like expensive flowers, then dressed in her best clothes, black pants and a white blouse that suddenly felt cheap and ill-fitting in this environment. She looked at herself in the mirror, trying to see someone confident and professional instead of someone scared and lost. Mrs. Chin knocked at exactly 7:30 with coffee and directions to Mr. Stone's office. He's usually in by 7, she explained as they walked. He doesn't sleep much, so he starts his days early. Don't take it personally if he seems distant at first. He's not used to having someone new around. Alexander's office looked different in the morning light, less intimidating and more like an actual workspace. He sat behind his enormous desk, reading something on his laptop while drinking coffee from a plain black mug. He'd traded yesterday's casual clothes for a dark suit that probably cost more than Zara used to make in 3 months, but somehow he still managed to look approachable. Good morning, Zara, he said without looking up from his screen. There's coffee on the table by the window and pastries if you're hungry. We have a busy day ahead of us. She poured herself coffee from a pot that was obviously high quality, adding cream from a small pitcher that felt heavy in her hands. Everything in this house spoke of money and taste, from the furniture to the food to the way light fell through windows that were probably custom-made. Alexander closed his laptop and turned his attention to her, those storm-gray eyes as unreadable as they'd been yesterday. I have 3 phone conferences this morning, a lunch meeting downtown and 2 more meetings this afternoon. I need you to take notes during the calls, research the companies we'll be discussing, and make sure I have all the relevant files for each meeting. He handed her a tablet and a leather portfolio, both clearly expensive and designed to make her look professional. Jessica left detailed instructions about the filing system and how I prefer things organized. Everything you need is in that portfolio. The morning flew by in a blur of names, numbers and business terms Zara only half understood. Alexander spoke with the casual authority of someone who'd been making million-dollar decisions since before she was born, discussing acquisitions and investments like other people talked about grocery shopping. She took notes frantically, trying to keep up with conversations that moved faster than she could follow. But she noticed other things too. The way he said please and thank you when asking her to do something, even though he didn't have to. The way he made sure she had everything she needed before starting each call. The way he explained things when he saw her looking confused, without making her feel stupid for not understanding. During a break between calls, he leaned back in his chair and studied her. How are you doing? I know this is a lot to absorb on your first day. It's different from what I expected, Zara admitted. I don't know what I thought. You thought I'd have you scrubbing floors or doing menial labor, he said, and there was something almost amused in his tone. I told you yesterday, Zara. I'm not a monster. I need an assistant, not a servant. She looked down at the tablet in her hands, at the notes she'd been taking about deals worth more money than she could imagine. Why me though? You could hire anyone. Someone with experience, someone who actually knows what they're doing. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Because sometimes circumstances put people where they need to be, even if that's not where they plan to go. You're smart, you're observant, and you're motivated to do well. That's more than I can say for some people who cost 3 times as much. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd received in months, and she felt warmth spread through her chest despite everything. Maybe this wouldn't be as terrible as she'd feared. Maybe she could survive 2 years of this life, maybe even learn something valuable along the way. The lunch meeting was at a restaurant that required reservations months in advance, where the servers knew Alexander by name and treated him with the kind of respect reserved for very important people. Zara sat quietly, taking notes while he discussed a potential partnership with 2 men in expensive suits who kept glancing at her curiously. My new assistant, Alexander said when one of them asked, his tone casual but somehow protective. She's still learning the business, but she's very capable. On the drive back to the estate, Zara found herself relaxing for the first time since this whole nightmare had started. The work was challenging but interesting, Alexander was demanding but fair, and nobody had treated her like a piece of property or a prisoner. Maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe this didn't have to be a bad experience. You did well today, Alexander said as they pulled through the estate's gates. Tomorrow we'll start working on some longer-term projects. I think you'll find them more interesting than just taking notes on phone calls. That evening, Zara ate dinner in her room while reviewing the notes she'd taken, trying to understand the complex web of businesses and investments that seemed to occupy Alexander's time. She was surprised to find herself genuinely curious about how it all worked, about the strategies and decisions that moved millions of dollars from one place to another. Maybe survival wasn't the only victory she could claim here. Maybe she could actually learn something, grow into someone stronger and smarter than the frightened girl who'd signed that contract yesterday. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it might not be the prison sentence she'd feared either. As she fell asleep in her comfortable bed, looking out at gardens lit by moonlight, Zara allowed herself to hope that the next 2 years might teach her things she never could have learned anywhere else. She was still trapped, still bound by circumstances beyond her control, but for the first time since this started, she didn't feel completely powerless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new glimpses into the complicated world of Alexander Stone. She was beginning to think there might be more to him than the reputation that had terrified her father's creditors. And despite everything, she found herself curious to learn what that might be. 3 weeks into her new life, Zara was beginning to understand the rhythm of Alexander's world. He woke before dawn, spent an hour in the private gym she wasn't allowed to access, then worked until well past midnight most days. He lived on coffee and determination, taking meetings with people across different time zones, managing investments that spanned continents, and somehow keeping track of details that would have overwhelmed a team of people. She'd learned to anticipate his needs, to have files ready before he asked for them, to take notes that captured not just what was said but what wasn't said in the pauses between words. The work was demanding but never boring, and she found herself looking forward to each day's challenges instead of dreading them. What surprised her most was how considerate he was, in small ways that seemed automatic rather than calculated. He always made sure she had lunch, even when he forgot to eat himself. When she'd mentioned missing her favorite coffee from a shop near her old apartment, a bag of those same beans had appeared in the kitchen the next morning. When she'd worked late helping him prepare for an important presentation, he'd arranged for Mrs. Chin to bring her breakfast in bed the following morning. "You don't have to do things like that," she told him when she found him reviewing her notes at 11 p.m., making sure she hadn't missed anything important. "The coffee, the breakfast, checking my work. The contract doesn't require you to be nice." He'd looked up from the papers scattered across his desk, those gray eyes reflecting fatigue and something else she couldn't identify. "The contract specifies your obligations to me, Zara. It doesn't say anything about how I'm supposed to treat you." He'd paused, setting down his pen. "Besides, basic decency isn't something you have to pay extra for." It was moments like that which made her wonder about the man behind the reputation. The Alexander Stone people whispered about in hushed tones didn't match the person who remembered she preferred her coffee with cream, who said please and thank you even when he didn't have to, who'd never once raised his voice or lost his temper despite the pressure he was constantly under. She'd started researching him in her spare time, using the internet access she'd been given for work purposes. The articles painted a picture of someone ruthless and calculating, a corporate shark who'd built his empire by destroying competitors and crushing anyone who stood in his way. But the details were always vague, the accusations always came from unnamed sources, and the more she read, the more she wondered how much of it was actually true. The closest thing she'd found to a concrete example was a story about a company called Brennan Industries, which had gone bankrupt after Alexander had bought up their debt and foreclosed on their assets. The articles made it sound like a hostile takeover designed to eliminate competition, but when she'd looked deeper she'd found that Brennan Industries had been systematically cheating their employees out of pension benefits for years. Alexander's company had bought the debt, yes, but they'd also made sure every employee received what they were owed before the company was dissolved. "You've been reading about me," he said one afternoon, catching her browsing news articles on her tablet during a break between meetings. It wasn't a question. Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to be caught. "I was curious about why people are so afraid of you. The stories don't match." She gestured vaguely at the office, at him sitting calmly behind his desk in jeans and a sweater, looking more like a college professor than a corporate predator. "Don't match what?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than offended. "They don't match you," she said honestly. "The person in those articles would have had me locked in a basement somewhere, not sitting in meetings taking notes and earning a fair wage." Something shifted in his expression, a wall coming down just slightly. "The person in those articles sells newspapers and generates clicks. The truth is usually more complicated than that." "So what is the truth?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to decide how much to tell her. "The truth is that I learned early that reputation can be more powerful than reality. If people think you're dangerous, they're less likely to try to cheat you or threaten the people you care about. Sometimes it's easier to let people believe the worst than to constantly prove you're not what they think you are." It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her, and Zara found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by this glimpse behind the carefully constructed facade. "But doesn't it get lonely? Having everyone afraid of you?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked away, toward the windows that showed his perfectly manicured but empty gardens. "Loneliness is safer than being vulnerable to people who would use your kindness against you." There was pain in those words, old and deep and carefully hidden. Zara wanted to ask more, to understand what had happened to make him build such high walls around himself, but she could see him already retreating back behind his professional mask. "We should get ready for the 3 o'clock call," he said, effectively ending the conversation. But for the rest of the afternoon, she caught him glancing at her thoughtfully, as if he was seeing her differently than he had before. That evening, Mrs. Chin invited her to have dinner with the household staff instead of eating alone in her room. The kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter that were rarely heard in the rest of the massive house. There were 6 people who lived and worked on the estate full-time: Mrs. Chin, the head housekeeper; James, the groundskeeper; Maria and Elena who handled cleaning and laundry, Robert who managed security and maintenance, and Thomas, the chef who prepared meals that belonged in five-star restaurants. "He's not what you expected, is he?" Mrs. Chin asked as they sat around the large wooden table, sharing a meal that Thomas had prepared with obvious pride. "No," Zara admitted. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to show his true colors or something. But he's been nothing but professional and considerate." James, a man in his 60s with calloused hands and kind eyes, chuckled. "You should have seen him when I first started working here 5 years ago. Thought he was going to fire me the first week because I accidentally damaged some rare flower he'd been trying to grow. Instead, he spent 2 hours helping me research how to save it, got his hands dirty right alongside me. He paid for my daughter's surgery when she needed her appendix removed," Maria added. "Insurance wouldn't cover all of it and I was trying to figure out how to pay the difference. He just took care of it, said it was a bonus for good work." "He visits Mrs. Patterson in the nursing home every month," Elena said quietly. "She used to be his secretary before Mrs. Chin came. She doesn't have any family left and her mind isn't what it used to be, but he still goes to see her. Brings her flowers from the garden." Zara listened to story after story of small kindnesses, of Alexander quietly taking care of people who worked for him, of a man who seemed to go out of his way to help others while maintaining a reputation that kept the world at arm's length. It painted a picture so different from what she'd expected that she almost couldn't reconcile it with the fearsome reputation that had made her father's creditors accept her as payment for his debts. "Why doesn't anyone know about this side of him?" she asked. "Why let people think he's someone he's not?" Mrs. Chin and the others exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. "That's his story to tell," Mrs. Chin said finally. "But I will say this, sometimes the people who act the strongest are the ones who've been hurt the most. And sometimes the only way to protect yourself from more hurt is to make sure no one gets close enough to cause it." That night, Zara lay awake thinking about Alexander sitting alone in his enormous house, surrounded by luxury and success but isolated from genuine human connection. She thought about the careful way he maintained distance even when he was being kind, the walls he'd built so high that most people never saw past them to the person underneath. She was beginning to understand that they weren't so different, she and Alexander Stone. Both of them were trapped by circumstances beyond their control, her by the contract that bound her to him by the reputation that kept everyone else away. Both of them were lonely in different ways, going through the motions of their days while longing for something more authentic, more real. The next morning she found herself paying closer attention to the small details of his behavior. The way he rubbed his temples when he thought no one was looking, betraying the headaches he never complained about. The way he stared out the window during breaks between calls, as if he was looking for something he'd lost. The way he sometimes started to say something personal, then caught himself and retreated back into professional courtesy. During their lunch break she made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of working through the meal as they usually did, she closed her laptop and looked directly at him. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He looked up from his sandwich, wariness flickering across his features. "You can ask. I might not answer. Do you ever get tired of being Alexander Stone?" The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared before. For a moment she thought he might deflect or change the subject. Instead he set down his food and really looked at her, those gray eyes searching her face. "Every day," he said quietly. "But I don't know how to be anyone else anymore." It was such an honest, vulnerable admission that Zara felt her heart clench. Here was this powerful, successful man who had everything money could buy, and he was trapped just as surely as she was, not by contracts or debts, but by the walls he'd built around himself and the reputation that had become both his shield and his prison. "Maybe you don't have to be," she said softly. "Maybe you could just be Alexander. At least sometimes. At least with people who aren't going to hurt you." He studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, surprise maybe or hope he was afraid to acknowledge. "And you think you're one of those people?" "I think I'm the only person in your life who's here because I have to be, not because I want something from you," she said. "That should make me safe, right? I can't use your kindness against you because I'm already bound by contract to stay here and do my job regardless of how you treat me." It was logic that cut both ways. She was safe because she was trapped, but he was also safe because her loyalty was guaranteed by legal obligation rather than affection that could be withdrawn. It should have felt cynical or cold, but instead it felt like the first honest foundation they could build on. Alexander smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face and made him look years younger. That's either very wise or very dangerous thinking, Zara Washington. Maybe both, she said, returning his smile. But I'd rather take the risk than spend the next 2 years pretending we're strangers. For the first time since she'd arrived, the silence between them felt comfortable instead of tense. And for the first time since she'd signed that contract, Zara began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this arrangement might give them both something they hadn't expected to find. The change in their relationship was subtle at first, like morning light gradually warming a room. Alexander began asking her opinion on things that went beyond simple administrative tasks. When reviewing potential investments, he'd explain the pros and cons of different decisions, then ask what she thought. When preparing for difficult meetings, he'd practice his presentations with her, accepting her feedback on everything from his tone to his arguments. "You have good instincts," he told her one afternoon after she'd suggested a different approach for a challenging negotiation. "You see things from angles I might miss." Zara felt a warmth spread through her chest at the compliment. It had been so long since anyone had valued her thoughts or treated her opinions as worthwhile. "I just think about what would convince me if I were in their position." "Empathy," Alexander said, nodding thoughtfully. "It's not a skill you see much in business, but it's probably the most powerful tool there is for understanding people." They began having lunch together regularly, not just working through meals but actually talking. Alexander told her about the companies he was considering acquiring, explaining the complex financial strategies in terms she could understand. Zara found herself genuinely interested in the puzzle of it all, the way different pieces of information fit together to create opportunities or reveal risks. "You could go back to school," he said one day when she mentioned how much she was enjoying learning about business. "Take some courses, get a degree in finance or economics. You have the mind for it." The suggestion caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on getting through each day, each week, that she hadn't thought much about what might come after her 2 years were up. "I don't know if I could afford that. Even after the debt is cleared, I won't exactly have savings built up." "There are ways to make education affordable," Alexander said carefully. "Scholarships, employer-sponsored programs, payment plans. If you decided you wanted to pursue it, we could figure out how to make it work." It was the first time either of them had talked about her future beyond their contract, and Zara felt something flutter in her chest, hope, maybe, or the beginning of dreams she'd thought were lost forever. "You'd really help me with that? You're going to be a valuable employee when this arrangement ends, Zara. Any company would be lucky to have you. I'd be investing in someone I believe in." That evening she found herself researching business programs at local colleges, imagining what it might be like to sit in lecture halls again, to have professors and classmates and a future that extended beyond the walls of this estate. For the first time in years, she began to think about what she wanted her life to look like instead of just how to survive it. The shift in their dynamic became more apparent during a difficult week when several deals hit unexpected complications. Alexander worked even longer hours than usual, surviving on coffee and stubborn determination while juggling multiple crises that each required his immediate attention. On Thursday evening, Zara found him still at his desk at nearly midnight, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups, rubbing his temples with the slow, careful movements of someone fighting a serious headache. "You need to get some sleep," she said from the doorway. "These problems will still be here in the morning, but you'll be better equipped to solve them if you're not exhausted." "I'm fine," he said automatically, not looking up from the financial reports he was reviewing. "No, you're not." She walked into the office, ignoring the way he tensed slightly at her approach. "You've been running on 3 hours of sleep for the past 4 days. You forgot to eat lunch yesterday and you've had more coffee than food today. That's not fine, that's unsustainable." He looked up at her then, those gray eyes shadowed with fatigue and something that might have been surprise. "Since when do you worry about my health?" The question was asked lightly, but there was real curiosity behind it. Zara realized she'd crossed some invisible line, moved from professional concern to something more personal. She could retreat, make some excuse about needing him functional for work purposes. Instead she chose honesty. "Since I started seeing you as a person instead of just the man who owns my contract," she said quietly. "You take care of everyone else, your employees, people who used to work for you, even strangers who need help. But no one takes care of you." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, as if he was trying to process what she'd said. "I don't need anyone to take care of me, Zara. I've been managing just fine on my own." "Have you?" She gestured at the chaos of his desk, at the evidence of days without proper sleep or meals. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're running yourself into the ground." "And for what? So you can solve every problem personally? So you can maintain control over every detail of every deal?" Because that's what's required, he said, his voice sharp with frustration. Because if I don't handle these things personally, if I trust other people to do them right, then everything falls apart. People get hurt, companies fail, employees lose their jobs. And you blame yourself for all of it, Zara interrupted, understanding flooding through her. Every failure, every setback, every time something goes wrong, you take it as personal responsibility. No wonder you can't sleep. Alexander went very still, his hands frozen over the papers on his desk. That's not. I don't. When's the last time you took a vacation? She asked gently. When's the last time you did something just because you enjoyed it, not because it served some business purpose? When's the last time you let yourself be human instead of trying to be perfect? He was quiet for so long that Zara wondered if she'd pushed too far, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I can't afford to be human, Zara. Too many people depend on me to make the right decisions, to be strong, to never show weakness. If I let my guard down, if I make mistakes because I'm tired or distracted or feeling sorry for myself, then you deal with the consequences just like everyone else does, she said softly. You don't have to be superhuman, Alexander. You just have to do your best and accept that sometimes your best won't be perfect. He looked at her then with an expression so vulnerable it made her chest ache. What if my best isn't good enough? What if people get hurt because I wasn't strong enough or smart enough or careful enough? Then you learn from it and do better next time, she said. That's what the rest of us do. That's what makes us human. She moved around the desk then, driven by an impulse she couldn't quite name. Alexander watched her approach with wide eyes, not moving as she reached out and gently touched his shoulder. Come on, she said. You need food and sleep in that order. These problems will wait until tomorrow. For a moment she thought he might argue, might retreat back behind the walls of professional distance. Instead, he nodded slowly and began gathering the papers scattered across his desk. Just let me finish organizing these. No. She placed her hand over his, stopping him from reaching for another file. Tomorrow, Alexander. It all waits until tomorrow. The touch of her hand on his seemed to freeze him completely. They were standing close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the fine lines of stress around his mouth, the way his breathing had changed at her touch. For a heartbeat, the air between them felt charged with possibility, with awareness of each other as more than employer and employee. Then Alexander pulled his hand away gently, stepping back to put distance between them. You're right, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I should get some rest. But as they left the office together, Zara could feel something had shifted between them. Some barrier had been lowered that couldn't easily be raised again. She'd seen behind his facade of perfect control, and he'd let her. They were both going to have to figure out what that meant for the remaining months of their arrangement. In the kitchen, she made him a sandwich while he sat at the small table where the staff usually ate, looking oddly domestic in the informal setting. They ate in comfortable silence, the enormous house quiet around them except for the soft sounds of their meal. Thank you, he said as they finished eating. For this. For caring enough to notice. Everyone deserves to have someone notice when they're struggling, Zara said. Even people who think they have to carry the world on their shoulders. He smiled at that, a soft expression that transformed his entire face. Is that what you think I'm doing? Carrying the world. I think you're carrying a lot more than you need to, she said honestly. And I think you've been doing it alone for so long that you've forgotten there are people who would help share the load if you let them. And you're one of those people? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Zara felt her heart beat faster as she considered her answer. I'm here, she said simply. For the next year and a half I'm here. You don't have to do everything alone. Alexander studied her face in the soft kitchen light, those gray eyes searching for something she wasn't sure she could give him. This isn't what either of us expected when you signed that contract. No, she agreed. But maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. As they said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, Zara felt the weight of what was happening between them. She was falling for him, not the reputation, not the wealth, not the power, but the man underneath it all. The one who worked too hard and cared too much and had somehow convinced himself that he had to face every challenge alone. It was dangerous territory for someone in her position. She was bound to him by legal obligation, not free choice. Whatever feelings were developing between them existed in the context of a relationship that was fundamentally unequal. But as she lay in her comfortable bed, thinking about the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen, she wondered if maybe they were both prisoners of their circumstances, both trapped by walls they'd built or had built around them. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to be free together. The next morning brought an unexpected crisis that would test everything they'd built between them. Alexander's phone rang at 5 a.m., jerking them both awake with the harsh sound of emergency. Zara could hear him in the hallway outside her room, his voice tense and clipped as he took the call. "I'll be there in 2 hours," he said, and she heard his footsteps moving quickly toward his room. By the time she dressed and made it downstairs, he was already in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, both of them moving with the efficiency of people handling a familiar crisis. "One of the factories in Ohio," Mrs. Chen explained when she saw Zara's questioning look. "There's been an accident. No one's seriously hurt, thank God, but the plant has to shut down for investigation." Alexander was dressed in a dark suit, his travel bag already packed and waiting by the door. His phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, each one adding another layer of complexity to whatever was happening. "I need you to reschedule everything for the next 3 days," he told Zara, his professional mask firmly in place. "The Morrison meeting, the conference call with Tokyo, the presentation for the Henderson Group. Move it all to next week if possible." "I'm coming with you," she said, surprising them both. He paused in the middle of checking his phone, looking up at her with raised eyebrows. "That's not necessary. This is going to be nothing but damage control and legal meetings. You'd be bored out of your mind." "Maybe," she said, already moving toward the door to get her own travel bag. "But you're going to be dealing with injured workers, worried families, regulatory investigators and reporters. You're going to need someone to keep track of details, manage your schedule and make sure you remember to eat. That's literally what you pay me for." Alexander opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. "It's going to be a difficult few days, Zara. This isn't the glamorous side of business." "I'm not looking for glamour," she said. "I'm looking to do my job." The flight to Ohio gave her a chance to see another side of Alexander's work, one that had nothing to do with investments or acquisitions. He spent the entire 2 hours on the phone with lawyers, insurance representatives, safety inspectors and company executives, orchestrating a response to the crisis that prioritized worker safety and family support over protecting the company's reputation. "I want every injured worker to have full medical coverage including follow-up care," she heard him say during one call. "I don't care what the insurance company says they'll cover. We cover everything and we cover it immediately." During another call, "Set up a fund for the families. Anyone who can't work because of this gets full pay until they can return. Anyone who needs additional support gets it, no questions asked. And then, I don't care about the stock price right now, Mitchell. I care about the people who got hurt working for us. Everything else is secondary." By the time they landed in Cleveland, Zara had a new understanding of why Alexander's employees were so loyal to him. He wasn't just protecting his business interests, he was taking care of people who depended on him, putting their welfare above profit margins and public relations concerns. The factory was a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by emergency vehicles and news vans. The accident had involved a malfunction in one of the assembly lines that had caused a small explosion and released chemical fumes into the work area. 12 people had been hospitalized, though thankfully none of the injuries were life-threatening. Alexander walked through the facility with the plant manager and safety investigators, asking detailed questions about every aspect of the accident. Zara followed, taking notes and coordinating with the various officials who needed his attention. She watched him talk to workers who'd witnessed the accident, their families who'd rushed to the hospital, and union representatives who were understandably concerned about safety protocols. "Mr. Stone," one of the injured workers said as Alexander visited him in the hospital that evening, "I just wanted to say thank you for covering all the medical bills. My wife was worried sick about how we were going to pay for everything." "You don't need to thank me, Miguel," Alexander said, pulling up a chair beside the hospital bed. "You got hurt working for my company. Taking care of you is the least I can do. How are you feeling?" As she watched him spend genuine time with each injured worker, asking about their families and their recovery, Zara realized she was seeing the real Alexander Stone, not the businessman, not the reputation, but the person who felt personally responsible for everyone in his employ. Later that night, in the hotel restaurant where they were staying, she finally understood the weight he carried. 12 people, he said quietly, staring into his coffee cup. 12 people went to work this morning thinking it was just another day, and they ended up in the hospital because of equipment my company should have replaced 6 months ago. The investigation isn't finished yet, Zara pointed out. You don't know that it was preventable. I know that I signed off on delaying the equipment upgrade because it was going to impact quarterly profits, he said, his voice hollow. I know that I chose money over safety and people got hurt because of it. You chose to keep the plant open and keep people employed, she corrected gently. If you'd shut down for the upgrade, how many families would have gone without paychecks? How many people would have struggled to pay rent or buy groceries? Alexander looked up at her, something desperate in his eyes. That's not. I can't use other people's needs to justify putting anyone at risk. You're not justifying anything, Zara said. You're explaining why you made a difficult decision with the information you had at the time. That's different from being careless or greedy. Is it? He rubbed his face with both hands, looking older than she'd ever seen him. How do I tell Miguel's wife that her husband got hurt because I was trying to balance profit margins? How do I look at his kids and explain that their dad might have permanent lung damage because I didn't want to spend money on new equipment? Zara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, the gesture automatic and unthinking. You tell them the truth. That you made the best decision you could with the information you had, that you're sorry it wasn't good enough, and that you're going to do everything in your power to make sure it doesn't happen again. He stared down at their joined hands, his breathing uneven. What if that's not enough? What if I can't make this right? Then you live with the guilt and use it to make better decisions in the future, she said softly. That's what human beings do when they make mistakes that hurt other people. They feel terrible about it, they do whatever they can to fix it, and they try to be better going forward. I'm supposed to be better than this, he whispered. I'm supposed to be smart enough and careful enough to prevent things like this from happening. You're supposed to be human, Zara said firmly. You're allowed to make mistakes, Alexander. You're allowed to be imperfect. What you're not allowed to do is torture yourself over decisions you can't change. For a long moment, they sat in silence, her hand still covering his in the quiet restaurant. Finally, Alexander turned his hand palm up, threading their fingers together in a gesture that felt both intimate and necessary. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. I don't know how to be responsible for so many people's lives and still sleep at night. I don't know how to make decisions that might hurt people no matter what I choose. I don't know how to be the person everyone expects me to be. Maybe the person everyone expects you to be isn't who you're supposed to be, Zara suggested. Maybe you're supposed to be exactly who you are, someone who cares so much about other people that you make yourself sick worrying about them. Someone who takes responsibility even when it's not entirely your fault. Someone who puts people before profits even when it costs you. Alexander looked at her then with an expression so vulnerable it made her chest ache. How do you do that? How do you see something good in me when all I can see are the ways I've failed? Because I know you, she said simply. I've watched you work 16-hour days because you care about doing things right. I've seen you remember the names of every single employee in every single company you own. I've watched you visit people in nursing homes and pay for surgeries and worry about strangers like they were family. That's who you are, Alexander. Not the mistakes you've made, not the decisions that didn't turn out perfectly, but the person who cares enough to lose sleep over other people's problems. He was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing gentle circles over her knuckles. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I've never had anyone see me the way you do, Zara. I've never had anyone look past the reputation and the expectations to see. Just me. Then you've been surrounded by the wrong people, she said softly. Because the real you is worth seeing. That night, as they went to their separate hotel rooms, Zara felt the weight of what was happening between them. They were crossing lines that probably shouldn't be crossed, developing feelings that complicated an already complex situation. But as she lay in her unfamiliar bed, thinking about the way he'd held her hand and looked at her like she was something precious, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more decisions, more weight for Alexander to carry on his shoulders. But tonight, for just a few hours, maybe he could rest knowing that someone saw him clearly and cared about him not for what he could provide, but for who he was underneath all the pressure and expectations. And maybe that was enough to start building something real between them, something that could survive the complicated circumstances that had brought them together. The crisis in Ohio lasted 4 days, during which Zara watched Alexander work tirelessly to ensure that every affected employee and their families were taken care of. He personally visited each injured worker multiple times, met with union representatives to address safety concerns, and implemented new protocols that went far beyond what was required by law. On their last night in Cleveland, the factory manager invited them to a dinner with some of the workers and their families. It was held in a community center near the plant, nothing fancy but warm and welcoming in a way that expensive restaurants never managed to be. Zara watched Alexander interact with people who knew him only as their boss, but who clearly respected him as a person. He remembered details about their lives, asked about their children's school activities, and listened with genuine attention when they talked about their concerns for the future. "You know," said Maria Santos, whose husband had been one of the injured workers, "when we first heard Mr. Stone was coming personally, some of the wives were worried. We thought maybe he'd be angry or try to blame the workers, or just care about protecting the company. Instead," added another woman, "he's been at the hospital every day. He held my baby so I could fill out insurance forms. He brought coffee for everyone in the waiting room. He treated us like family." Alexander looked uncomfortable with the praise, but Zara could see how much it meant to him. These people weren't afraid of his reputation because they'd experienced his character firsthand. Later, as they walked back to their hotel through the quiet streets, Alexander was unusually quiet. "You okay?" Zara asked as they entered the lobby. "Just thinking," he said. "About what Maria said. About how they expected me to be angry or blame them for what happened." They rode the elevator in comfortable silence, but when they reached their floor, Alexander didn't immediately head to his room. Instead, he stood in the hallway looking lost in thought. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly. "Of course. Do you think I'm a good person, Zara? Not a good boss or a successful businessman, but a good person." The question was asked so quietly, with such genuine uncertainty, that it broke her heart a little. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I think you're one of the best people I've ever known." He studied her face as if trying to determine whether she meant it. "Even knowing how I built my reputation. Even knowing that I've used fear and intimidation to get what I wanted. Even knowing that you've spent years protecting people by making yourself the villain in other people's stories," she said. "Even knowing that you'd rather have people think you're dangerous than let them see how much you care about them." Alexander leaned against the wall, suddenly looking exhausted. "I'm tired, Zara. I'm tired of being afraid to let people close. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of pretending that I don't need anyone when the truth is—" "What?" she prompted gently when he trailed off. "The truth is that I've been lonely for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone actually see me. And then you came along and you saw through everything I've spent years building, and I don't know what to do with that." They were standing close now, close enough that she could see the conflict in his gray eyes, the war between wanting to trust and being afraid of the vulnerability that trust required. "You don't have to do anything with it," she said softly. "You don't have to change who you are or tear down walls you've built for good reasons. You just have to decide whether being seen is worth the risk of being hurt." "And what if I decide it is?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I decide that having someone who knows the real me is worth the risk of everything else?" "Then you take it one day at a time," she said. "You trust as much as you can when you can, and you see what happens." Alexander reached out then, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "What's happening between us, Zara? What is this?" She leaned into his touch, her heart racing at the warmth in his eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "I know it's complicated. I know it's not what either of us planned. But I know that when I look at you, I don't see my employer or the man who owns my contract. I see someone I care about, someone I want to protect and support, and maybe even—" "Maybe even what?" he asked when she hesitated. "Maybe even love," she whispered, the words barely audible in the quiet hallway. Alexander's breath caught, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her cheek. "Zara? I know it's impossible," she said quickly. "I know the situation is too complicated, that there are too many reasons why this can't work. But I can't help how I feel about you." For a moment she thought he might step away, might retreat back behind his carefully constructed walls. Instead he moved closer, his other hand coming up to frame her face. "It's not impossible," he said quietly. "It's just complicated." "What's the difference?" "Impossible means there's no way to make it work. Complicated just means we have to figure out how." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. It was a kiss full of longing and uncertainty, of feelings they'd been fighting for weeks, of the recognition that they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "I want to try," he said quietly. "I want to figure out how to make this work, whatever this is." "Even though I'm not here by choice?" she asked. "Even though our relationship started with a contract instead of a choice?" "Maybe it started with a contract," he said, his hands still cradling her face. "But what we have now, what we're building together, that's a choice we're both making every day." "Alexander." She started, not sure how to voice the fears that were crowding her mind. "I know," he said, understanding without her having to explain. There are 100 reasons why this is complicated. But there's one reason why it's worth trying, because what we have is real, Zara. Whatever brought us together, what we feel for each other is real. As they finally said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, Zara felt like her entire world had shifted. The man she'd been hired to work for had become someone she cared about deeply, someone she might even love. The contract that had bound her to him felt less like imprisonment and more like an opportunity to build something genuine and lasting. But even as she fell asleep thinking about his kiss and the promise in his eyes, she knew they were entering uncharted territory. Mixing business with personal feelings was always risky, but when the business relationship was built on legal obligation rather than choice, the stakes were even higher. Still, as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't bring herself to regret taking the risk. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the person she was supposed to be with. Whatever complications lay ahead, she was ready to face them as long as Alexander was willing to face them with her. Tomorrow they would return to Chicago, to the estate that had become home, to the complicated reality of their situation. But tonight, she allowed herself to hope that love might be enough to overcome any obstacle they might face. They returned to Chicago changed, though they didn't talk about it directly. Alexander was gentler with her, more open in small ways that probably weren't visible to anyone else but meant everything to Zara. He touched her hand when he handed her files, stood closer when they reviewed documents together, and looked at her with warmth that made her stomach flutter. For her part, Zara found herself anticipating his needs in ways that went beyond professional efficiency. She made sure he had his favorite coffee ready when he had early meetings, reminded him to eat lunch when he got absorbed in work, and stayed late to help with projects that were important to him without being asked. "You two seem different," Mrs. Chin observed one morning as they prepared for a busy day of meetings. "More comfortable with each other?" Zara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We work well together." Mrs. Chin smiled knowingly but didn't push the subject. "He's happier," she said simply. "It's good to see." The peaceful routine they'd built was shattered on a Tuesday morning when Zara's father showed up at the estate's front gate. She was in Alexander's office, reviewing contracts for a potential merger, when Mrs. Chin knocked on the door with an expression of concerned confusion. "Miss Washington," she said carefully, "there's a man at the gate claiming to be your father. He's insistent about seeing you." Zara's blood went cold. She hadn't heard from Thomas since the day he'd signed her over to Alexander's representatives, hadn't even known if he was still in Chicago. The fact that he'd shown up here at the estate could only mean trouble. "Should I have security escort him away?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled but his eyes alert with concern. "No," Zara said, though every instinct told her to hide. "I should see what he wants." "But..." She looked at Alexander uncertainly. "Could you be there?" "I don't want to face him alone." Alexander nodded without hesitation. "Of course." Thomas Washington looked older than his 58 years, his clothes wrinkled and his face bearing the telltale signs of someone who'd been drinking heavily. He paced nervously in the estate's elegant receiving room, clearly out of place among the expensive furniture and artwork. "Zara, baby," he said when she entered, his voice carrying the false heartiness of someone trying to pretend everything was normal. "Look at you all dressed up and fancy. This place is treating you well." "What do you want, Dad?" she asked, staying near the doorway where Alexander stood slightly behind her, a silent but reassuring presence. "Can't a father visit his daughter? Can't I see how you're doing, make sure you're okay? You lost the right to pretend you care about my well-being when you used me as collateral for your gambling debts," Zara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Thomas's face flushed, his eyes darting between her and Alexander. "Now that's not fair, baby. I was in a desperate situation. I did what I had to do to keep us both safe." "You did what you had to do to save your own skin," she corrected. "So what do you want now? More money? Another favor?" "I'm in a bit of trouble again," Thomas admitted, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a persuasive whisper. "Nothing serious, just a misunderstanding with some business associates. I need a little help, just to tide me over until things settle down." Zara felt Alexander tense behind her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "How much?" she asked, though she already knew she wasn't going to help him. 50,000, Thomas said quickly. "I know it sounds like a lot, but for someone like Mr. Stone it's pocket change. And I'm family, Zara. Family helps family. Family doesn't sell each other to pay debts," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that made Thomas take a step back. "Now look here," Thomas said, his false friendliness disappearing as he realized he wasn't going to get what he wanted easily. I don't know what kind of arrangement you two have worked out, but that's my daughter. I have rights. You signed away your rights when you signed that contract, Alexander said, moving to stand beside Zara in a gesture of protection and solidarity. You have no claim on her, no right to ask her for anything. Thomas's face grew red with anger and desperation. You think you're so high and mighty, don't you? Big shot businessman with your fancy house and your reputation. But I know people too, Mr. Stone. I know people who'd be very interested to hear about your personal interests. The room went very quiet. Zara felt her stomach drop as she realized what her father was implying, that he would use her relationship with Alexander as leverage, would threaten to spread rumors or cause scandal if he didn't get what he wanted. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Washington? Alexander asked, his voice dangerously calm. I'm suggesting that a man in your position wouldn't want certain stories getting around, Thomas said, gaining confidence as he sensed he'd found a pressure point. Stories about inappropriate relationships with employees, about taking advantage of vulnerable young women. The press loves that kind of thing, don't they? And the business community, well, they're funny about moral standards. Zara felt sick. Her father was threatening to destroy Alexander's reputation and possibly his business unless he was paid off. It was extortion, pure and simple, and it was exactly the kind of thing she'd been afraid of when she'd started developing feelings for Alexander. Get out, she said quietly. Zara, baby, be reasonable dash. Get out, she repeated louder this time. Get out of this house, get out of my life, and don't ever come back. You can't just throw away family like that, Thomas said, his voice becoming wheedling. I'm your father. I raised you, I took care of you dash. You gambled away our home, our security, and finally me, Zara said, her voice shaking with anger. You forfeited any claim to being my family when you chose your addiction over my well-being. Thomas looked between her and Alexander, realizing that his threats weren't working the way he'd planned. This isn't over, he said finally. I know people who can make things very difficult for both of you if I don't get what I need. Mr. Washington, Alexander said calmly, I suggest you leave now before I have security escort you off the property. And I suggest you think very carefully before making any more threats, because I have resources you can't imagine and very little patience for people who try to hurt the people I care about. After Thomas left, Zara collapsed into one of the chairs, her hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. Alexander knelt beside her, his hands covering hers with gentle warmth. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. I'm so sorry he came here, that he threatened you. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. Hey, Alexander said softly, moving to sit on the arm of her chair so he could pull her against his side. This isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. He's going to cause problems for you, she said, accepting the comfort of his embrace despite her guilt. He's going to spread rumors or lies or whatever he thinks will hurt you enough to make you pay him. Your reputation dash. My reputation can handle whatever stories a desperate gambling addict wants to tell, Alexander said firmly. I'm more concerned about you. Are you okay? Zara looked up at him, seeing genuine concern in his gray eyes instead of the anger or blame she'd expected. How can you be so calm about this? He just threatened to destroy everything you've built. Because I've been threatened before, Zara. Powerful people always have enemies, always have someone trying to find leverage against them. Your father isn't the first person to try extortion, and he won't be the last. But this is different, she insisted. He can use our relationship against you. He can make it look like you're taking advantage of me, like you forced me into something inappropriate. That could ruin you. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her hair in soothing motions. Is that what you think this is? That I'm taking advantage of you? No, she said immediately. Of course not. But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what people will believe when they hear that you have a romantic relationship with someone who's bound to you by contract. Then maybe it's time to change that, Alexander said quietly. Zara pulled back to look at him, confused. Change what? The contract, he said, his expression serious but determined. Your father's debt is nearly paid off anyway. We can void the contract, make you a regular employee with a regular employment agreement. Remove any suggestion that you're here against your will. The suggestion should have filled her with relief, but instead it made her stomach clench with fear. And what if I choose to leave? What if, without the contract binding me here, I decide I want something different? Then you leave, Alexander said simply, though she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. And I'll miss you terribly, but I'll know that whatever we had was real because you chose it freely. It was a gesture of trust and love so profound that it took her breath away. He was willing to give up the legal guarantee of her presence, willing to risk losing her entirely, just to make sure that anything between them was based on choice rather than obligation. You'd really do that? She asked. You'd risk me walking away? I'd rather risk losing you than know you stayed because you felt you had no choice, he said. If we're going to build something together, Zara, it has to be because we both want it, not because circumstances forced it on us. Before she could respond, his phone rang with an urgent tone that meant emergency calls only. Alexander glanced at the screen and frowned. It's my security team, he said, answering immediately. Stone here. Zara could only hear one side of the conversation, but Alexander's expression grew increasingly grim as he listened. How many? He asked. And they're credible? I see. Yes, implement Protocol 7 immediately. And I want full background checks on everyone involved. No, don't engage directly yet. Just observe and report. He hung up and turned to Zara with an expression that was both protective and concerned. Your father moved faster than I expected. He's already been in contact with 3 different tabloid reporters, offering to sell them a story about my inappropriate relationship with a vulnerable employee. Zara felt her world tilt sideways. Oh God. Alexander, I'm so sorry. I should have known he'd do something like this. I should have dash. You should have what? Alexander interrupted gently. Predicted that your father would try to extort money by threatening to destroy both our reputations? This isn't your fault, Zara. But I'm the reason he has this leverage, she said desperately. If I hadn't developed feelings for you, if we hadn't crossed those lines, then we'd both be miserable and alone, and your father would have found some other way to try to get money, Alexander said firmly. The problem isn't that we care about each other. The problem is that your father is a selfish man who's willing to hurt his own daughter to satisfy his addiction. His phone rang again, this time showing the name of his lawyer. The conversation was brief but telling. Yes, I understand the potential implications, Alexander said. But I want you to prepare the paperwork anyway. Void the employment contract and prepare a standard offer letter. No, I don't care about the risk. It's the right thing to do. When he hung up, Zara was staring at him with something approaching awe. You're really going to do it? You're going to free me from the contract even though it gives my father more ammunition against you. I'm going to do what I should have done weeks ago, Alexander said. I'm going to make sure you have choices, real choices about your own life. And what if the tabloids pick up the story? What if they paint you as someone who preys on vulnerable women? Alexander smiled, but there was steel beneath the warmth. Then I'll deal with it the same way I've dealt with every other challenge in my life, directly and honestly. The truth is that I fell in love with an extraordinary woman who happens to work for me. The truth is that I want to spend the rest of my life with her if she'll have me. And if people want to make that into something ugly, that says more about them than it does about us. Zara felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of gratitude and love rather than fear. I love you too, she whispered. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. Alexander cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Then we'll face whatever comes together. Your father, the media, the complications, all of it. We'll face it together and we'll come out stronger on the other side. As he kissed her, soft and reassuring and full of promise, Zara realized that the man she'd once thought of as dangerous was actually the safest person she'd ever known. Not safe in the sense of predictable or easy, but safe in the ways that mattered. He would protect her, support her, and love her no matter what storms they had to weather together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Her father's threats were real, and the potential for scandal was genuine. But for the first time since this whole adventure began, Zara felt like she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. Whatever came next, they would face it as equals, as partners, as two people who had chosen each other despite all the reasons they shouldn't have. And that, she thought, was worth fighting for. The next few days passed in a blur of legal consultations, media strategies, and security briefings. Alexander's team worked around the clock to prepare for whatever story Thomas might try to sell, while simultaneously preparing the paperwork to void Zara's employment contract. The good news is that most reputable publications won't touch a story like this without more evidence than the word of a man with your father's history, Alexander's publicist, Jennifer, explained during a strategy meeting. The bad news is that there are plenty of less reputable outlets that would run it without verification. So what's our best defense? Alexander asked, his arm resting protectively around Zara's shoulders as they sat in his office. The truth, Jennifer said simply. We get ahead of the story. We control the narrative instead of reacting to it. That afternoon, Alexander called a press conference, something he rarely did for personal matters. Standing in front of the media room in his company's downtown building, with Zara beside him, he looked calm and confident despite the gravity of the situation. I've called you here today to address some rumors that may be circulating about my personal life, he began, his voice clear and steady. It's been brought to my attention that someone may be attempting to sell a story suggesting that I have an inappropriate relationship with an employee. He paused, looking directly into the cameras. I want to set the record straight. Yes, I am in a relationship with Zara Washington, who has been working as my personal assistant. No, there is nothing inappropriate about our relationship. Miss Washington is an intelligent, capable woman who came to work for me under unusual circumstances, and over the course of several months, we developed feelings for each other. Zara felt her heart pound as reporters began scribbling notes and camera flashes went off around them. This was it, the moment when their private relationship became public knowledge, when they stepped out from behind the protective walls Alexander had built around his personal life. To ensure that there are no questions about Miss Washington's autonomy or freedom of choice, Alexander continued, effective immediately, her employment contract has been voided and replaced with a standard employment agreement. She is free to leave at any time, and her decision to remain is entirely her own. A reporter raised her hand. Mr. Stone, can you comment on allegations that Miss Washington was used as collateral for a debt? Miss Washington's previous circumstances are her story to tell if she chooses to do so, Alexander said firmly. What I can tell you is that she has conducted herself with professionalism and integrity in every aspect of her work, and any suggestion otherwise is completely false. Another reporter called out, what about the power imbalance inherent in a romantic relationship between an employer and employee? This time, Zara stepped forward to the microphone, surprising everyone including Alexander. If I may, she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. I understand the concern about power imbalances, and it's a valid question. But I want to be clear that at no point has Mr. Stone used his position to pressure or coerce me in any way. Our relationship developed naturally, and every step has been my choice as much as his. She looked directly into the cameras, thinking about her father somewhere out there, probably watching this unfold. I also want to address something directly. If anyone approaches you with claims about my character or my relationship with Mr. Stone, I urge you to consider the source and their motivations. Some people will say anything for money, even if it means hurting their own family. After the press conference, they returned to the estate to wait and see how the story would be received. Alexander's phone buzzed constantly with calls from business associates, board members and investors, all wanting to know how this might affect their relationships with his company. Most of them are supportive, he told Zara after spending 2 hours returning calls. A few are concerned about potential scandal, but nobody's threatening to pull their investments or end partnerships. Yet, Zara said, pacing nervously around his office. Hey. Alexander caught her hand as she passed his chair, pulling her to stop beside him. We did the right thing. We told the truth, we controlled the narrative, and we faced it together. Whatever happens now, we can handle it. That evening, as they were having a quiet dinner in Alexander's private dining room, Mrs. Chin knocked with a concerned expression. Mr. Stone, there's someone at the gate. He says he's a reporter from the Chicago Tribune, and he has some information he thinks you'd want to see. Alexander and Zara exchanged glances. Send him to the main entrance, Alexander said. And ask James to stay nearby just in case. The reporter was a man in his 40s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years chasing stories. He introduced himself as David Chin, and his first words immediately put them on edge. Mr. Stone, Miss Washington, I wanted to speak with you before I publish anything, because I think you should know what I've discovered about Thomas Washington's activities over the past few days. He pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table between them. Your father, he said to Zara, has been busy. He's approached 7 different media outlets with his story, but he's also been in contact with some of your business competitors, Mr. Stone. Alexander's expression sharpened. What kind of contact? The kind where he's offering to provide them with inside information about your personal life and business practices in exchange for money, David said. He's claiming to have access to confidential information about your company through his daughter. Zara felt the blood drain from her face. That's not true. I've never shared confidential information with him. I haven't even spoken to him since Dash. I know, David said gently. I've done my research, Miss Washington. Your father has a history of making false claims for money. The problem is that some of these competitors might not care whether the information is true or false. They might be willing to pay him just to cause problems for Mr. Stone. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. What's your interest in this, Mr. Chin? Why bring this to us instead of just publishing whatever story you're working on? David smiled slightly. Because I don't like seeing good people get hurt by con artists, even when the con artist is family. I've been investigating your father for months, Miss Washington, in connection with several other scams he's been running. This situation with you just gave me another angle to explore. He opened the folder and showed them photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. Thomas Washington owes money to at least 6 different creditors, not just the ones who originally held his debt. He's been running up new gambling debts while using his connection to you as leverage to try to get advance money from various people. So he's been using my name to borrow more money, Zara said, her voice hollow with realization. And now he's desperate enough to try to destroy both your reputations to get a big enough payoff to clear his debts, David confirmed. The good news is that I have enough evidence of his other fraudulent activities to keep him busy with law enforcement for quite a while. Alexander reached for Zara's hand, squeezing gently. What do you need from us? Just your permission to publish the real story, David said. The story about a gambling addict who's been using his daughter's situation to run various cons, including attempting to extort money from her employer. It's a better story than the one he's trying to sell, and it has the advantage of being true. That night, as they waited for David's story to break, Zara found herself on the estate's terrace, looking out over the gardens that had become so familiar over the past months. Alexander joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft in the darkness. I keep thinking I should feel sadder about this, she admitted. About my father destroying any chance of a relationship with me, about him going to jail. But mostly I just feel relieved. Like maybe this is finally the end of his ability to hurt people. You're allowed to feel however you feel about it, Alexander said. He's your father, but he's also someone who's caused you a lot of pain. It's okay to be angry with him. It's okay to be done with him. Zara leaned back against his chest, grateful for his solid presence behind her. What happens now? After the story comes out, after the media attention dies down? Now we figure out what our life looks like, Alexander said. We decide where we want to live, whether you want to go back to school, what kind of future we want to build together. Together? She asked, turning in his arms to look at him. If you want it, he said, his gray eyes serious in the moonlight. If you choose it. Every day from now on, Zara, it's your choice. As she kissed him under the stars, surrounded by gardens that had witnessed their journey from strangers to something approaching love, Zara realized that choice was exactly what she'd been fighting for all along. Not just the legal freedom to leave, but the emotional freedom to stay because she wanted to, because she'd found something worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and the beginning of whatever came next. But tonight she was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the person she wanted to be with. And for the first time in her life that felt like enough. David Chen's story broke the next morning, and it was everything they'd hoped for and more. Rather than focusing on rumors about Alexander and Zara's relationship, the article detailed Thomas Washington's pattern of fraud and extortion, painting him as a desperate con artist rather than a concerned father. The piece included interviews with several of his victims, documentation of his gambling debts, and a timeline that showed how he'd been using Zara's situation to run various scams. Listen to this, Alexander said, reading from his tablet as they sat in the breakfast room. Sources close to the investigation describe Thomas Washington as a serial fraudster who has shown no qualms about exploiting his own daughter's difficult circumstances for financial gain. His recent attempts to extort money by threatening to spread false rumors about Stone Industries CEO Alexander Stone and his employee Zara Washington appear to be his most desperate gambit yet. It's strange seeing my family's dysfunction laid out in black and white for the whole world to read, Zara said, though she felt more relief than embarrassment. But at least now people know the truth. Alexander's phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters wanting comments, business associates expressing support, and even a few people who'd apparently been scammed by Thomas in the past and wanted to share their stories. The board called an emergency meeting for this afternoon, Alexander told her as he returned from taking yet another call. They want to discuss the situation and its potential impact on the company. Are you worried? Zara asked, seeing the tension in his shoulders despite his calm demeanor. Not really, he said, though she could tell he was being careful not to show his full concern. The story makes it clear that we're the victims here, not the perpetrators of anything improper. If anything, the coverage has been sympathetic. But that afternoon, as Alexander left for his board meeting, Zara couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. She spent the time researching Thomas's arrest, which had happened that morning when he tried to collect money from someone David's article had warned about his fraudulent activities. Mrs. Chin found her in the library, staring at news articles on her laptop without really reading them. "How are you holding up?" the older woman asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Zara admitted. "Everything's been too easy today. The press has been sympathetic, the police arrested my father, Alexander's business associates are being supportive. When has anything in my life ever worked out this well?" Mrs. Chin smiled gently. "Maybe it's time for things to start working out well for you. Maybe you've been through enough difficulties to earn some happiness." "What if the board decides I'm a liability?" Zara asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if they think my connection to my father makes me a risk to the company? What if they pressure Alexander to fire me or end our relationship?" "Then Mr. Stone will have a choice to make," Mrs. Chin said simply. "And based on everything I've seen over the past few months, I think you know which choice he'll make." When Alexander returned that evening, his expression was unreadable. He found Zara in his office, pretending to organize files while actually worrying herself sick about what the board might have said. "How did it go?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Alexander closed the door behind him and leaned against it, studying her face. "Interesting meeting," he said finally. "Lots of opinions, lots of discussion about reputation management and corporate image." Zara's heart sank. And they voted unanimously to commend me for handling the situation with integrity and transparency," he said, his serious expression breaking into a smile. "They also voted to offer you a position in the company's business development department, with a substantial raise and your own office downtown." "What?" Zara stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Apparently, several board members were impressed by how you handled yourself at the press conference," Alexander explained, moving to sit on the edge of his desk. "They think you'd be an asset to the company in your own right, not just as my assistant." "But that would mean..." Zara tried to process what he was telling her. "It would mean you'd be an independent employee with your own career path and your own income," Alexander said. "It would mean that anything between us personally would be completely separate from your professional life." It was everything she could have hoped for, the kind of opportunity she'd never dreamed possible when she'd first signed that contract months ago. But it also meant leaving the work she'd grown to love, leaving the daily collaboration with Alexander that had brought them so close together. "What if I don't want the promotion?" she asked quietly. "What if I want to keep working as your assistant?" Alexander's expression softened. "Then you keep working as my assistant. The choice is entirely yours, Zara. Whatever you decide, whatever makes you happy, that's what we'll do." "And us? What happens to us if I take the new position?" "We figure it out," he said simply. "We date like normal people date. We go to dinner and movies and boring work events together. We argue about whose turn it is to pick what to watch on TV. We wake up together and fall asleep together and build something real and lasting and completely ordinary." The picture he painted was so beautifully mundane, so wonderfully normal, that it brought tears to her eyes. "Is that what you want? Something ordinary? With you?" Alexander stood and moved to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "With you, ordinary sounds like the most extraordinary thing in the world." Zara looked into his gray eyes and saw her future there. Not a future defined by contracts or circumstances or other people's expectations, but a future built on choice and love and the daily decision to be together. "I want the promotion," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I want my own career and my own office and the chance to build something for myself." "And us?" Alexander asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already knew her answer. "I want us too," she said, leaning forward to cup his face in her hands. "I want boring dinners and movie arguments and waking up together. I want ordinary and extraordinary and everything in between." When he kissed her, it tasted like freedom and possibility and the promise of a future they would write together. Outside, the autumn sun was setting over gardens that had witnessed their journey from strangers to lovers, from employer and employee to partners in every sense of the word. "There's one more thing," Alexander said when they finally broke apart. "Something I need to ask you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and Zara's breath caught in her throat. "I know it's soon," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. I know we've only been free to choose each other for a matter of hours. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you, every single day. He opened the box to reveal a ring that was elegant and beautiful without being ostentatious, exactly what she would have chosen for herself if she'd been brave enough to dream of this moment. Zara Washington, he said, his gray eyes locked on hers, will you marry me? The answer came without hesitation, straight from her heart. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, absolutely yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Zara realized that the contract that had brought them together had been torn up and replaced with something infinitely more valuable, a promise they were making to each other freely, willingly, and with complete understanding of what they were choosing. The scared young woman who had signed her name on that contract months ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more certain of her own worth. And the man who had seemed so dangerous and untouchable had revealed himself to be exactly what she needed. Someone who would protect her without controlling her, someone who would love her without trying to change her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, and the beginning of a life they would build together as equals. But tonight, as they celebrated their engagement in the house that had become their home, surrounded by people who had become their family, Zara knew that every difficult moment had been worth it to arrive at this perfect beginning. 6 months later, Zara stood in front of the mirror in the estate's master bedroom, adjusting the simple but elegant white dress she'd chosen for their wedding. It wasn't a traditional wedding gown, they'd decided on a small, intimate ceremony in the estate's gardens rather than a formal church wedding, but it felt perfect for the woman she'd become. You look beautiful, Mrs. Chin said from the doorway, her eyes suspiciously bright as she watched Zara put on the pearl earrings that had been Alexander's grandmother's. I'm nervous, Zara admitted, though it wasn't the kind of nervous that made her want to run. It was the good kind of nervous, the kind that came from standing on the threshold of something wonderful and life-changing. That's normal, Mrs. Chin said, coming into the room to help with the final touches. Mr. Stone is nervous too, though he's trying to hide it. He's been pacing the library for the past hour, checking his watch every 5 minutes. Zara smiled, picturing Alexander in his elegant black suit, probably running his hands through his hair and driving his groomsmen crazy with his restless energy. They'd chosen to have a small wedding with just the household staff, a few close business associates, and the handful of real friends they'd managed to maintain despite Alexander's formerly reclusive lifestyle. Her new position at Stone Industries had been everything she'd hoped for and more. Working in business development had challenged her in ways she'd never expected, and she'd discovered a talent for analyzing potential investments and building relationships with clients. More importantly, it had given her the independence and professional identity she'd needed to feel like Alexander's equal rather than his employee. Are you ready? Mrs. Chin asked, offering her the small bouquet of flowers James had grown specially for the occasion. I've been ready for months, Zara said, accepting the flowers and taking one last look in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was confident, happy, and absolutely certain about the choice she was making. The ceremony was held in the garden where she'd first begun to see Alexander as more than just her employer. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle around a simple arch decorated with climbing roses, and the late spring afternoon provided perfect weather for an outdoor celebration. As she walked down the makeshift aisle, Zara's eyes found Alexander immediately. He stood beneath the arch in his dark suit, his gray eyes bright with emotion as he watched her approach. Beside him stood Robert, the estate's security manager who had become one of Alexander's closest friends, serving as his best man. Elena, one of the housekeeping staff who had become like a sister to Zara over the past months, walked beside her as her maid of honor. They talked about asking someone from her old life to participate, but the truth was that the people at the estate had become her real family, the ones who had supported her through the most difficult and transformative period of her life. The ceremony itself was simple and personal, with vows they'd written themselves rather than traditional religious language. When it came time for Zara to speak, she looked into Alexander's eyes and spoke from her heart. Alexander, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, when I first came here, I thought my life was over. I thought I was trapped, powerless, with no control over my own future. But you showed me that even in the most difficult circumstances, we always have choices. You chose to see me as a person rather than an obligation. You chose to treat me with kindness and respect even when you didn't have to. And most importantly, you chose to love me not because you had to, but because you wanted to. She paused, blinking back tears of happiness. Today I choose you not because I'm bound by any contract or circumstance, but because you make me want to be the best version of myself. Because you see me clearly and love me anyway. Because with you I'm not afraid of the future, I'm excited about it. Alexander's vows were equally heartfelt, his voice rough with emotion as he spoke about how she'd changed his life, taught him to trust again, and shown him that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. Zara, he said, taking her hands in his, you came into my life during one of your darkest moments, but you brought light with you. You taught me that love isn't about power or control or protection from the world. It's about partnership, about choosing each other every day, about building something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was met with applause and cheers from their small but enthusiastic audience. As they walked back down the aisle together, Zara felt like she was floating, overwhelmed by the joy and possibility of their new beginning. The reception was held on the estate's terrace, with tables set under twinkling lights and music provided by a small string quartet. It was elegant but intimate, exactly the kind of celebration that felt right for their journey together. So what's next for you two? Asked Jennifer, Alexander's publicist, who had become a friend over the months since the media crisis. Honeymoon? Moving? Starting a family? Zara and Alexander exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that had developed between them over their time together. Actually, Alexander said, we've been talking about starting a foundation. Something focused on helping families dealing with addiction, providing resources and support for people in situations like what Zara went through. It was Alexander's idea, Zara said, squeezing her new husband's hand. He thinks my experience gives me insight into what people in those situations really need. Our experience, Alexander corrected gently. We're partners in this just like everything else. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Zara found herself alone with Alexander on the terrace, looking out over the gardens that had become so meaningful to their story. Any regrets? Alexander asked, pulling her close as they swayed slowly to music only they could hear. Only one, Zara said, smiling up at him. I regret that it took a crisis to bring us together. I wish we could have found each other under better circumstances. I don't know, Alexander mused, spinning her gently under the stars. I think we found each other exactly when we were supposed to. You needed to discover your own strength and I needed to learn how to let someone in. Maybe it had to happen the way it did. Maybe you're right, Zara agreed, thinking about the frightened young woman who had signed that contract almost a year ago. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. Besides, Alexander added with a grin, where's the romance in a normal meeting? Hi, I'm Alexander, I saw you across a crowded coffee shop. Doesn't have nearly the same dramatic flair as, they sold her to the most feared millionaire in America. Zara laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet gardens. When you put it like that, it does sound like something out of a romance novel. The best love stories always have impossible odds to overcome, Alexander said, his expression growing more serious. And ours definitely qualified. As they stood together in the moonlight, Zara reflected on how completely her life had changed. The scared, powerless woman who had arrived at this estate had been replaced by someone confident, successful, and deeply loved. The man she'd feared had become her greatest source of strength and support. I love you, Mrs. Stone, Alexander whispered against her hair. I love you too, Mr. Stone, she replied, savoring the sound of her new name and all the possibilities it represented. They'd overcome impossible odds, faced down threats and scandal, and emerged stronger than either of them had been alone. Their love story had begun with a contract, but it would continue with a choice they made fresh every morning, the choice to build a life together, to support each other's dreams, and to face whatever challenges came their way as equal partners. As they walked hand in hand back toward the house that had become their home, Zara knew that the best part of their story was just beginning. They had a lifetime ahead of them to write new chapters, to create new adventures, and to prove over and over again that love really could conquer anything, even the most impossible circumstances. The scared young woman who had been sold to pay her father's debts was gone forever, replaced by a confident woman who had chosen her own destiny. And the feared millionaire who had hidden behind walls of reputation and isolation had found someone worth tearing those walls down for. Together they were unstoppable. Together they were home.